Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on energy safety nets. I'm Hannah Gerardo, and I'm delighted to be moderating this conversation today on behalf of Sustainable Energy for All. The Energy Safety Nets report series distills and builds on critical lessons learned from 6 countries' experiences with government-led approaches to support the very poor and vulnerable to access essential modern energy services. The principle of leave no one behind is absolutely central to the Sustainable Development Goals and is a goal we will not meet if the poorest and most disadvantaged households and communities lack access to electricity and clean cooking fuels and technology. If we are dedicated to reaching truly universal access by 2030, we, as the energy access community and policymakers, must take meaningful action to create and build on efficient, targeted, and sustainable programs that address barriers to accessing energy connections and benefiting from ongoing energy use. A number of countries have experimented with varying degrees of success with linking energy subsidies to social assistance mechanisms. We summarize these experiences and bring together the many lessons learned in the synthesis report, Energy Safety Nets, Leveraging Public Finance and Social Assistance Mechanisms to Close Energy Access Affordability Gaps for the Poor. And as Andrew will highlight later in this webinar, the series also includes a guide for policymakers as a practical tool for helping governments and ministries tailor the design of energy safety nets to best fit the needs of their population. This first of its kind research is intended to be one tool to inform best practices at the intersection of energy policy and social assistance to protect the very poor, vulnerable, and marginalized people. We at SEforALL are thrilled to have supported this work alongside our partners, the Overseas Development Institute and the Catholic Agency for Overseas Development, ODI and CAFOD, as well as our research partners in Brazil, Ghana, India, Indonesia, Kenya, and Mexico, listed here. With that, I would like to not waste any more time and introduce our presenters today. First, we have Andrew Scott, the Director of Programs for Climate and Energy at ODI and a lead author of this series. Following Andrew, we will hear from Mrefu Barasa, the Managing Partner at EED Advisory and a lead author of the Kenya country case study. I will also acknowledge on the line, we have authors Sarah Weiss, Lead Analyst for Climate and Energy at CAFOD, and Sam Packard, Senior Research Officer at ODI, who also contributed an immense amount to this report and are here with us today. So with that, I will just address a couple of housekeeping items. For this initial conversation, we will have a little less than an hour remaining for Andrew to walk us through the research background and key findings. Following Andrew, we will hear from Mrefu on the Kenyan experience with energy safety nets and discuss the case study his team prepared for this series. We will close with as much time as possible for Q&A. On that note, you will see a Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. Please feel free to submit your questions there as they come up throughout the conversation, and we'll do our best to cover those throughout the hour. Please also feel free to share your questions with us at ESN@SEforALL.org as you read the report and dig a little bit deeper into the findings. I will note that we will be recording this webinar and it will be shared online shortly. So if you have other colleagues that would like to have participated in this high-level overview but weren't able to join today, please send them to SEforALL.org/ESN. With that, I will turn it over to Andrew. Thank you everyone for joining.
Thank you very much, Hannah. I'm Andrew Scott, as Hannah said, working for the Overseas Development Institute. And what I'll do is talk you through a little bit of the background to the research conclusions and findings, and a little bit of discussion about what next. To start at the beginning, as Hannah said, the Sustainable Development Goals, which include a target for universal access to affordable, reliable, and modern energy services by 2030, also incorporate a principle of leave no one behind. This universality principle means that even the most marginalized and vulnerable people in the world should have access to affordable, reliable, and modern energy services if we're going to regard the SDG 7 as being achieved. But I think, as we all know, the poorest often can't afford modern energy services. And for the most marginalized, those services may not even be available physically. So this raises a question about how best to enable the poorest to be supported to have access. General energy subsidies have a long history, but they also have a bad name. They benefit poor households, but overall are regressive in nature, meaning that they benefit households at all income levels, and the majority of the benefit goes to the better off, largely because they consume more energy. Energy subsidies, general energy subsidies, also can account for a large share of scarce public finance, and they can encourage the consumption of fossil fuels, which contribute to greenhouse gas emissions. So the question is, what are the alternatives to general energy subsidies? Outside the energy sector, social assistance and social safety nets are used in many countries to protect and ensure minimum standards of living. So the question arose several years ago now, whether or not social assistance mechanisms can be used to enable access to affordable, reliable, and modern energy services. But there's little evidence available to answer this specific question. So ODI and CAFOD decided to work together to see whether we could answer any of this question, and undertook a literature review, which found it more literature perhaps than we expected, but limited in-depth analysis, particularly on the relationship between social assistance mechanisms and energy access. There are examples of cash social assistance type mechanisms being used to enable energy access, such as cash transfers, but the research and analysis on these schemes tended not to look at the question of energy access. So with the support of Sustainable Energy for All, we were able to undertake more in-depth research to try and fill in this knowledge gap. We took a country case study approach with a view to drawing lessons from across the experience of several countries. And the research approach adopted the four key questions that you see on your screens about what policy measures have been used to enable poor and marginalized people to access energy services. How effective have they been? What links do they have or have they had with wider social assistance programs? And then finally, clearly, what changes might be possible to make them more effective with a view to enhancing access to modern energy services. We selected 6 countries for the case studies: Brazil, Ghana, India, Indonesia, Kenya, and Mexico. In each of these countries, there has been some experience both of energy access and social assistance programs. So we wanted to ensure that the case studies looked at countries where there has been some experience, and we wanted to ensure that the group of case studies includes a variety of contexts to be able to draw lessons. With the contribution of the in-country research partners that we saw listed at the beginning, the case studies examined a total of 25 different measures that have been used in those countries to support energy access for poor and marginalized households. These broadly fell into 4 categories. Next slide, please. Defined by the purpose that the support was for, in terms of whether was it for connections or was it for energy consumption, and the form of energy supported, electricity and LPG. In 1 or 2 countries, there were also instances of support, for instance, for improved cook stoves, but the majority of the 25 different measures fell into one of these four categories. The research approach overall was to look at available secondary sources and available data, and then to interview key informants and convene stakeholder workshops. In some countries, there was limited statistical data available about the impact and effectiveness of the measures, and limited research into their impact. But each of the case studies provides a good picture of the advantages and disadvantages of the different measures examined. Next slide, please. Before we go into looking at what we found in the research, it's important just to remind ourselves what we mean by an energy safety net. The phrase itself, energy safety net, was one that we devised when we were doing the literature review as a phrase to distinguish between general subsidies for energy and subsidies that are targeted at the poor and marginalized. So an energy safety net under this definition is a government-led approach or a measure or a program to support poor and vulnerable people to access essential modern energy services, meaning electricity and clean fuels and technologies for cooking. These measures are to enable people both to afford the energy services, but also to overcome other measures of deprivation or marginalization, which may not be financial, but may be cultural or physical. In other words, looking at general poverty and deprivation. To ensure comparability across the countries, however, the study focused on households in the bottom income quintile, but the detail of the country case studies shows that other factors than income are used by governments to identify target groups, both for energy services support and for social assistance. But those measures vary from country to country. In some, energy safety nets are similar in purpose to social safety nets, supporting access to essential services for people who otherwise wouldn't be able to access them. But the support is focused on energy consumption. What we found both in the literature review and in the research was that the social assistance world tends not to think very much about energy, and the energy world tends not to think very much about social assistance. And what we were trying to do with the idea of energy safety net is bring these two related schools of thought together. Next slide, please. Using this definition, out of the 25 measures that were examined in the 6 country case studies, 13 could be classified as energy safety nets. The other measures did not meet the criterion, largely because of the absence of clear targeting. So let's take a quick look at some of the types of things that we were looking at in the research, and then I'll provide an outline of the key findings. Next slide. And what I'll do is I'll go through the 4 different categories of measure one by one. As far as connections for LPG are concerned, and by connections we're talking about the people being able to access cylinders and the burners and other fittings that are necessary to use LPG. Depending on the scheme that was looked at, the support provided could have been in-kind grants, in other words, people being given free access to the equipment, or there was a combination of grants and concessionary loans. In Ghana and Mexico, the LPG programs for connections had limited duration and limited reach. in Ghana, the reach wasn't very far. In Mexico, it was a very short-lived scheme. In Kenya, there was a very small pilot project, and the initiative to support connections for LPG didn't get beyond that. By contrast, in India and Indonesia, there have been really massive programs to provide LPG connections, with 80 million households reached in India and 42 million households in Indonesia. In Indonesia, though, the scheme did not really target poor households. The aim was to get everybody to start using LPG. The smaller schemes in Ghana and Mexico used a geographic targeting mechanism by focusing on the provision of cylinders and equipment to people in particular districts, or in Ghana's case, in rural areas. But in India, the large program, their supporting connections targeted poor and disadvantaged households by using national registers and nationally used eligibility criteria for the provision of social assistance support. Next slide, please. On the electricity connection side, the schemes that we looked at were in 4 countries. And again, were provided in the form of a combination of in-kind grants, i.e. people having free connections, as was the case in Brazil, or a combination of grants and loans. The targeting approach varied depending really on the existing extent of electrification in each country. In Brazil and Mexico, for example, where there's a high level of electrification, the focus of the programs was on reaching and electrifying remote and unconnected communities. In Ghana and Kenya, the programs were primarily aimed at reaching any household that was unconnected to the electricity system, focusing perhaps more on households that are closer to the grid, but not with any particular poverty focus. Moving on to the consumption side of the equation. Next slide, please. With LPG, the subsidy there was for households to have reduced prices for the refill of cylinders. The targeting approach varied. The very large scheme in India targeted the support at delivering the support to women in households, in eligible households. And in India, they've started introducing a poverty targeting for the provision of the LPG subsidy that's linked to their social assistance register. Again, the challenges in some countries were that these schemes were short-lived. In Brazil, there was a very short-lived scheme providing support for LPG consumption integrated into a social assistance program, which I'll come to later. And in Ghana and Mexico, again, the schemes didn't last beyond a few years. The uptake of LPG has also varied, and we found in the case studies that there is still often an affordability challenge for the poorest households to be able to refill their cylinders, and in some cases actually to have access to refill facilities or refilling centers. One possible solution to that is to reduce the size of the cylinder. That would then reduce the cash outlay that's required. But that's certainly been followed in Indonesia and in 1 or 2 of the other countries. Moving on to consumption of electricity, the main form of support for the consumption of electricity in all the countries included in the case studies, and many countries that weren't, is through a lifeline tariff system, where the electricity tariff is divided into blocks, and the lowest block is supplied at a subsidized price. The size of that low block, however, varies between countries, as you see from the diagram. In Kenya, for instance, it was moved to 100 kilowatt hours per month. In Ghana, it was moved down from 100 kilowatt hours to 50 kilowatt hours. And you also see from the diagram that the subsidized connections or subsidized tariffs reach quite high levels of consumption in some countries. So a real challenge for targeting with the electricity consumption support is the level of the threshold for the subsidy. What we also found, though, was that the eligibility for that lifetime tariff can be linked to social assistance criteria for eligibility and the social assistance register. In Indonesia, the utility company has begun to start linking, using the social assistance register to be able to determine which households should have the subsidized tariff. So having looked at the four categories in very brief outline, there's much more detail in the case studies and in the synthesis report, and I think we'll get a little bit more in the Kenya case from Mrefu in a few minutes. But let me just now outline some of the lessons that we learned from the research and some conclusions that we drew as a result of the analysis. So next slide, please. First of all, on targeting, as I said earlier, one of the big failings of general energy subsidies is that they're simply not targeted. And the question is how can we best target the benefit, recognizing that there will be households that require that support in order to access essential energy services. The case studies found that the targeting approach can vary between support for connections and support for consumption, and it varies between electricity and LPG. In the case of connections, the targeting also varied according to the level of electrification. So where electrification is high, targeting became quite specific, but quite often all we found was a more general form of targeting, an indirect form, including what we labeled geographical targeting, which is where the subsidy is directed towards the geographical area, not necessarily the poorest households within that area, but any household within that area. But the selection of the area can be related to the incidence of poverty. And then we also found, particularly with the lifeline tariffs, that the targeting mechanism was a form of self-selection, in that people were able to decide whether or not they were going to consume electricity up to the threshold or not. But again, we found in some cases that the threshold was way above the actual level of consumption of the poorest households. In terms of the links to social assistance programs, we identified two kinds of link. One was the integration of a component within a social assistance program specifically intended to support energy consumption. This occurred in Brazil and in Mexico. But the case studies found that that component tended to lose its identity and become absorbed into social assistance generally. And the level of support that provided did not necessarily keep in trail with the level of the price of the energy, particularly for LPG. The second kind of linkage was where there's a coordination between the support program for energy access and social assistance. And we found in 4 of the countries links or the use of broader social assistance registers or databases for the selection of beneficiaries of energy access or support for energy access. Brazil and Brazil and Mexico have well-established national social assistance programs with well-established infrastructure and administrative infrastructure that lend themselves to this. Ditto in India and Indonesia, where the national scheme can be used to enable targeting. In many cases, though, this energy support program is not necessarily using that. And one of the conclusions is, I think, that we should be thinking about how those social assistance registers or databases can be used to enable support for energy access. And I think one of the other questions linking the targeting question with the social assistance question is to make sure that the selection of the targeting mechanism, whether it's linked to social assistance or not, is suitable for the national context, because in many countries still that we don't yet have national social assistance registers. So to draw some broad conclusions, highlighting again, first of all, that when we're thinking about energy access, we need to draw a distinction between, are we supporting connections or are we supporting consumption? Because the kind of targeting that you might use and the type of measure that you might use to support that a connection or consumption might differ. And I think it's also important to remember that if we are focused just on the SDG 7 target and its designated indicators, we're led down a route of focusing on connections. And what actually matters is, and what the case studies clearly show, is that connections don't necessarily lead to consumption. And so we need to draw a distinction about where the support is being provided. Finally, secondly, we need to, as I was saying earlier, to think about the targeting, targeting that's clear for the context, think about how targeting has implications for the energy needs of the poorest households, and to think about particularly whether there are different needs within a household. And again, drawing a distinction that who gets the benefit can make a difference to some of the answers. The targeting mechanism also needs to think about the administrative and infrastructure side of support, institutional infrastructure that might be necessary to enable it to be used. When we're thinking about the energy access consumption side of the equation, we need to be thinking about what level of support is required to enable essential energy consumption. And one person's essential energy consumption may be different from another's. There may be differences due to geography or climate, differences due to household size and composition, differences due to cultural and other factors. So when designing the energy safety net, we need to be thinking about the consumption levels that are to be supported and the extent to which they are achieving the primary objective of enabling energy access for marginalized households for essential needs. And maybe there's a debate that we will eventually get into as a result of thinking about that, as to what is that level of threshold that is required as essential. The fourth conclusion is around the question of what's the best way to deliver the subsidy when you've decided whether that you're going to support a connection or consumption or LPG or electricity. And I think it's important to understand that the context of a particular country, its existing institutions, its geography, its economic and social context, are all relevant to the question of thinking about how that subsidy should be delivered. And we need to be thinking about how the delivery of the subsidy in terms of, can it be used to achieve other objectives? In India, for example, there is a link between the subsidy for LPG and access to financial services for women. The mechanism is directed and delivered directly into the bank accounts of women in eligible households, and that both ensures a targeted delivery of the subsidy, but it also supports women's access to financial services. So how this subsidy is delivered is one of the factors to be thinking about. And then finally, one of the things that we found in several countries was that the policy for the provision of access, support for access to energy, varied from time to time. We found that in some cases a particular mechanism was short-lived, more for political reasons than for other reasons. We found that there are political factors used to decide when what the level of a threshold is going to be for essential energy consumption. And we found that overall, political commitment to the provision of the support for energy access is a critical factor in ensuring that it can be done effectively and in a sustained way. The massive programs that we looked at in Indonesia and India are massive because there has been political commitment to their delivery. And we don't necessarily find that in every country. So I'm going to stop there now and pass over to Murefo, who will tell us a bit more about the findings in Kenya.
All right, thank you very much, Andrew. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're calling in from. Let me start by thanking Hannah and the SEforALL team for putting together this webinar, and also just more broadly for funding and coordinating this activity. So I'll start by just giving an overview of Kenya for those of you who may not be familiar with the country. So next slide, please. Yes. So Kenya has 47 counties. These are not autonomous region, so it's not a federal system. It's a unitary system, but administrative tasks and also political tasks are decentralized across these 47 counties. Then if you look at the high level numbers, the current population is 47 million. And this is just from the recently concluded national census. This was done in 2019. If you look at the access rates, there's been a jump from 23% in 2009 to 64% currently. 64% is the number that has been adopted by the SDG tracking initiative led by the World Bank and the ESMAP team in particular. However, the recent national census, which I just mentioned, actually has a lower number than this. So there needs to be, I think, some further discussions on this number. This number has actually been contentious for some years now because Kenya Power has reported different numbers. There has been other surveys that have reported different numbers. But I think now with the national census, then I think it's safe to say that the numbers are just above 50%. Then access to clean cooking. So it's reported as 7, and then it has increased to 14%. Although a recent national cooking sector study, which was released after we concluded our report, has this number just slightly below 30%. So in terms of this study, when we opted to look at energy safety nets, we looked at it through the two broad energy uses at a household level, so electric energy and thermal energy, and for thermal energy in particular, cooking. So under electricity, again, we looked at grid and off-grid, and on grid, we found at least 3 interventions that could be classified as energy safety nets. This is the Kenya Power-led slum electrification project, the last mile connectivity program, and the lifeline tariff. Then under the off-grid section, we have the Kenya Off-Grid Solar Access Project. This is funded by the World Bank and is implemented by Kenya Power and the Ministry of Energy. Then also on the off-grid, there's a pilot project being implemented by UNICEF across 2 counties. These are the counties of Kilifi and Garissa, called Energy and Cash Plus Initiative. Under cooking, we divided again into 2 sub-components. So there's a fuel sub-component and the technology sub-component. And there's the National Oil Corporation of Kenya initiative that Andrew already mentioned, called Gas Yetu. This is a subsidy program that was to promote access to the LPG tank amongst the poor. And I'll talk a bit more about this in the next slide. Then on the technology, there's a Kenya Off-Grid Solar Access Project. Under this project, there's a subcomponent that provides subsidies to distributors and vendors of technology, cooking technologies in 16 select counties. So there are several initiatives that I could talk about, but I just want to zoom in on four initiatives. So the first one is COSAP, and in front of you, you see a map of Kenya with the 47 counties. So the counties are color-coded according to the energy safety nets that are applied within that context. So for example, the counties in purple receive benefits from the COSAP initiative, from the slum electrification project, from the last mile connectivity project, and the lifeline tariff. But let me talk a bit about these 4 initiatives. So this is the COSAP, the slum electrification project, and the lifeline tariff, as well as the last mile connectivity project. So the COSAP initiative was birthed out of the realization that there are certain counties in Kenya that have been left behind when you think of electrification. Essentially, these are the counties in the north and the northeast, and to some extent, the southeast section of Kenya, excluding Mombasa and Lamu counties. And so there was this initiative that targets to provide access to electricity through mini grids and solar home systems across 16 counties. The target is to provide these solutions to about 1.2 million households. And there's also a component that promotes access to cooking technologies or improved cooking technologies with a target of about 200,000 households. So the project has already been kicked off, and the managers are SNV together with a company called Sunfunder. So they're the ones that are managing the subsidy component, the subsidy distribution component of this project. The other project I'd like to talk about is the LMCP, which is the last mile connectivity project. This has been a very interesting project because the electrification rate in Kenya has gone up quite fast over the last 4 years. In fact, it's been a case study worldwide. And to a great extent, this can be attributed to this LMCP. So LMCP targets to connect households within a 600 meters radius from select transformers. And the households pay only an equivalent of about $150. This can be paid upfront, or it can be paid through a monthly payment scheme. And the target is to connect just slightly above 1 million households. Then there's a lifeline tariff, which Andrew has talked about. So with Kenya, it's based on the volume differentiated tariff. So the band is between 0 and 100 kilowatt hours. And again, one of the key recommendations based out of this is that the government needs to think a little bit closer on targeting, because between 0 and 100 kilowatt hours covers more than 90% of the household clients to KPLC. So essentially, even those that may not be necessarily classified as poor are also benefiting from this. Then the last one is a slum electrification program or project. This was delivered under the World Bank GPOBA program. GPOBA stands for Global Partnership on Output-Based Aid. And this is a subsidy program where Kenya Power would get a subsidy for every connection in the slum area that is achieved. So this also has been quite successful, although also it has had its challenges. The target was to connect 1 million households. And the connection fee was reduced to just about $1.20 per connection, which is about 1,160 Kenya shillings. All right. Then some of the recommendations that we had based on this literature review was something that already Andrew alluded to, which is there's a need to distinguish access and consumption. So if it's a subsidy scheme that promotes access, there is merit to think about it slightly different compared to that which promotes consumption. So for example, the lifeline tariff promotes consumption, while the last mile connectivity project, for example, promotes access. And we also felt that there's a need for third-party or independent verification, because a lot has been achieved, but it's all self-reported numbers, for by and large self-reported numbers. So the recommendation was that it would be useful to also have a third-party look at these numbers. Then the third is the use of technology. Here in particular, we recommended the use of M-Pesa as much as possible to disburse the subsidy in different programs, as opposed to cash, because there are obvious benefits to this approach. And then we also came across cases where the cost of a connection was relatively high, and our conclusion was perhaps the process was not as competitive as it should have been. And then the last key recommendation was to anchor these programs in policy, just to ensure that they are long-term and sustainable. Because in any case, it's inevitable that we'll have a portion of the country under the poverty line, at least in the medium to long term. Then finally, we gave, so just the last slide, the next slide, please. So in terms of policy action, we had three key policy action recommendation. So one, we noticed that there was a suboptimal coordination between the Ministry of Energy and the Ministry of Labor and Social Protection. So both institutions were doing similar interventions, but were not talking to each other, and therefore they failed to benefit, one, from the experience of each party, and also just from the network and the learning and the infrastructure that already exists. And then there was a critical need to integrate gender-sensitive planning and implementation. There was hardly any gender disaggregated data on any of these interventions. And then finally, there was a lack of institutionalization of these approaches. So many of them either exist through a policy declaration, but they are not institutionalized, in the sense that an institution does not exist around the implementation, and therefore the intervention remains vulnerable to the program. So at the end of the program, there are chances that the intervention may not be supported or funded beyond the period of the program. So we felt that there's need to house these institutions within existing, these interventions within existing institutions. And I think those are all my slides. So I'll stop there and hand it over back to Andrew.
Thank you, Marifu. Andrew, if you could maybe take just a few more minutes to describe the next session so we have time for Q&A. And for everyone else, please feel free to start submitting some questions in the Q&A function in the Zoom box. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Hannah. I'll be very brief. One of the things that governments will need to do in many countries over the next few years is to think about how they're going to support the poorest and most marginalized people in their country to access and use modern energy services in order to achieve the targets of SDG 7. The relatively small study that we've undertaken with SEforALL and with the support of CAFOD and the in-country researchers such as Marifu, provides a number of insights into what policymakers need to consider when designing energy safety net programs. And next slide. Very, very briefly, what we've produced out of the research is a guide for policymakers that provides a simple, relatively straightforward process map to lead policymakers and their advisors through the questions they will need to consider when designing an energy safety net. From the initial decision to proceed with a safety net right through to implementation. I'm not going to go through the detail of the flowchart. It's there in the slides, it's there in the policy guide, and I'll let everybody look at it in leisure. But what I think we concluded from the research, though, was that the answers to all of these questions for policymakers, as they go through this process map, are going to vary from country to country depending on a country's context, both in terms of its energy resource, its social and economic situation, the level of development of its social assistance infrastructure, the level of development of its energy infrastructure. But the core questions for for designing an energy safety net are going to be pretty similar across countries. And with more experience of the use of this process map and the more experience of the development and implementation of energy safety nets, we might be able to develop a more detailed form of guidance for policymakers. But I think as come through both a little bit from what I've said and what from Marifu has said, one of the challenges at the moment for us is that the quantity, the availability of detailed information about household level energy consumption can be quite limited. And therefore governments are going to have to think through, as they develop energy safety nets, what else they need to think about in terms of being able to have the information that they need to guide them through this process. But as I said, the core questions are still there. And we hope that this policy guide will help people think through the key questions that they'll need to consider when thinking about how they're going to enable the poorest and most marginalized people to have access to modern energy services. I'll stop there, Hannah, and let's have some questions.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, both of you. I know, as Andrew mentioned, this is an incredibly small slice of the information you can find in the reports, but you can visit those at the links shown above and follow along as we kind of publish a bit more online. Before we dive into the questions, I want to turn to Sarah from CAFOD to share a bit of insight on this series from CAFOD's perspective. So I think, Sarah, if you can take a minute or two to share a few words about the report, how you see this work in the kind of overall energy access landscape. So we have a couple questions coming in and we'll try to get to those, maybe running minutes over on time. Thank you.
Thanks, Hannah. So my name's Sarah Wykes, and I work for CAFOD, which is a Catholic Agency for Overseas Development. So very much the perspective we're coming at the research from was from an organisation that actually works with a lot of energy poor communities through partners in different countries. And I guess the main thing I wanted to say was, obviously for us, the driver for this research really was trying to understand how, through our, in terms of our own programmatic work, what type of approaches to planning and delivering energy services really would help to connect the poorest. And so this kind of the intuition or the intuitive insight that there was a real affordability gap, particularly for the poorest, in terms of them being able to consume energy services and products. That was something very much coming out from the ground. But as Andrew was saying, there really was a lack of a kind of evidence base to look at what type of policy changes would be needed to address that affordability gap. So we're very, very happy that we now have this kind of emerging evidence base. It definitely needs to be extended. We would hope that, can also be, there could be more research done in the future. And we also very much look forward to it becoming a tool that we can use to engage with policymakers on different approaches to developing energy safety nets, really as a way of ensuring that we do reach SDG 7 and that it does leave no one behind. And I'd just like to say, as a complement to this, I think for CAFOD, a kind of synergistic piece of work that we're involved in is also looking at how we can actually make planning approaches, so planning energy service approaches, more inclusive, and to really understand and get down to that level of granularity about the different energy needs that different segments of end users have and that are living in very different contexts. And that's a piece of work that CAFOD is doing with IIID on inclusive energy planning. But I think I'll leave it there. Thanks, Hannah.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and great points that really tie in with some of the questions we're getting currently. I think, as you mentioned, there's this emerging evidence base, and I know folks on the call are working on this topic as well, and especially kind of how we deliver some of these support services in different contexts and learn from the experiences that are ongoing. I think to that point, I'd like maybe Murefu, if you can expand a bit upon your answer in the Q&A function to Hannah's question. Do any of the measures specifically target people living in rural areas with decentralized solutions, so mini grids or solar home systems? I think this is quite a big conversation, especially kind of in the off-grid solar world right now. And so it'd be interesting to learn from you a bit more about maybe the COSAP example or the UNICEF Energy and Cash Plus projects. If you could just take a few seconds to share a bit more about those.
Right. So under the COSAP project, which is the Kenya Off-Grid Solar Access project that I mentioned, there are 16 underserved counties, and they're defined as being underserved because their access rates are significantly below the national average. And this program looks to develop a number of mini grids, as well as supporting the uptake of solar home systems. So some of you may be familiar with Kenya, but for those who are not, so the population distribution in Kenya is such that about 70% of or 2/3 of the population reside in less than 1/3 of the area. And therefore you have 1/3 residing in the rest of the country. And therefore the populations in those areas are, they're scattered, and the loads are not concentrated as the rest of the country. So most of the 16 counties are actually found in that part of Kenya. And because of that, the government, of course, together with the World Bank, thought of coming up with this intervention. So like I said, for the solar home systems, it's a subsidy. And then for the mini grids, the government is actually building them out. And the cost of power will be cross-subsidized by the rest of the clients in the national utility.
Fantastic, thank you so much. And I think, like I said, there's a lot of ongoing work on this front, and so we very much look forward to engaging with all of you on kind of building out this piece of the research and understanding. Maybe as one of our last questions, I'll kick a couple. Andrew, do you have any insight, or are you able to provide any context to the question about energy efficiency as a safety net? I know there's some examples, particularly here in the US, where this has been used widely, but are there any examples you found in the literature on energy efficiency?
Thanks, Hannah. No, on the energy efficiency question, I think we have a real challenge in that the information or the quantity, the availability of information about energy consumption within a household in most developing countries is extremely limited. Understanding what kind of equipment, what kind of appliances, what kind of light bulbs people are using is very difficult from a broad range of reasons. The Ghanaian case study did highlight that for some low-income households, the low efficiency of appliances that they might be using, for example, fridges, meant that their level of energy consumption was relatively high and could take them above the lifeline tariff threshold. The efficiency of appliances, the efficiency of equipment can be important from the point of view of considering what level of subsidy and what form of subsidy to provide to the poorest households. But to be able to draw broader conclusions from that, I think we need to have much more information about appliances, efficiency of appliances, and even simple questions about the levels of energy consumption in physical terms of households before we can begin to answer that. But the point is very valid that energy efficiency is a factor that we need to be thinking about.
Thank you, Andrew. I think you touch on a great point that there's quite a bit of data that's very much still needed to be able to target these programs and make them as efficient and sustainable as possible. And I think that's one of the pieces that SEforALL is most looking forward to kind of addressing in the ongoing term. Maybe as a last question, I'll offer to each of you to answer a bit more on kind of the political will, how best to engage governments on this topic, whether it's in your organizations or kind of us as a energy access community. And I think one of the questions that came through the chat was, how long should we wait for governments to actually implement these programs? Are there things that we can do kind of in the meantime to push for support in this way? Maybe Andrew, we'll start with you, Marifu and Sarah, if you have any quick thoughts on that.
Thanks, Hannah. I think the first question here is getting government recognition by policymakers that energy access, both connections and consumption, is a policy priority from the point of view of both achieving sustainable development goals and achieving national development objectives. Without that level of political support, I think it's going to be very difficult for governments to set aside funds for safety net schemes and to spend the money that might be necessary to develop and implement them. Kenya, and Marifu might want to comment on this, has built into its constitution the right for people to have access to energy and the right for people to have access to social assistance support. And the level of investment that's gone into the last mile connectivity project, for instance, is a reflection of that level of political commitment. Other countries that we looked at, for instance, Mexico, India, Indonesia, their governments spend millions every year on their energy safety net programs because they have that level of political commitment. So I think the starting point is there. And once that is there, then you can start putting the process in place to start developing the safety net.
I'll add and say one effective way I find, and of course this is not the only way, is to shine a light on the issue. And one way to shine the light on this issue is using data. So for example, here in Kenya, when you think about poverty, most people think of these 16 underserved counties that I mentioned. And if you look at the proportion of the population that's under the poverty line, yes, those 16 counties have the largest proportion under the poverty line. But surprisingly, Nairobi County, which has the lowest proportion under the poverty line, also has the second highest number of people in absolute terms living below the poverty line. So bringing out those issues. So for example, when you talk about the poor, many people think of rural areas, they think of remote areas, they think of arid areas, but you find that there's a significant number of actually poor people living in urban areas. So communicators using these kinds of statistics and this kind of data, I think should be able to capture the government's attention. I'll give you another example. So after this national survey was done, one of the numbers that the cabinet secretary picked and kept on repeating is that the number of people, the number of deaths attributed to household air pollution, which has a direct link to the use of traditional forms of cooking, has a higher, is higher almost 3 times than the number of deaths attributed to traffic accidents. And therefore it becomes a national issue because now you have a number, you have data that you can put across. So I would say one of the ways is definitely to gather this data, to put this data across, because then that crowds in interest.
Thank you so much. Sarah, I don't know if you have any kind of last thoughts. I mean, you mentioned some work that CAFOD and IAD are doing, but how can communities kind of work to stay engaged and advocate for their needs on this topic?
Yeah, so I think, as Andrew and Marif said, I think data and awareness of the problem, you know, and is very important. But I think you need, along with political will, you need clear targets, you know, for delivering energy access and implementing policies. And I think Kenya is very interesting in that respect because it now has an Energy Act, but it also has sub-national energy planning and development planning. So I think that's a real opportunity, for example. So counties, there's 47 counties are mandated to produce county energy plans. And, you know, this is for a CAFOD, we're saying unless you have more inclusive, you need more inclusive planning because you need to have more demand-led planning. So really, if you're going to efficiently allocate, you know, governments have scarce budgets. If you're really going to efficiently allocate your budget to make sure that you are, you know, that the public subsidy part of that, if you like, is going to be directed towards the poorest, you know, and you're not creating market inefficiencies, etc. You know, you really need to basically ensure that you have the right sort of planning processes in that really include those people who are the poorest, because they will be able to tell you what their needs are. So we see the planning piece as very, very important here, but it also, you know, there has to be a clear policy target, and then there have to be implementing targets. I think the other thing that came out very clearly in the research, which Andrew mentioned, was also, you know, coordination between different line ministries. That seems to be a key feature in some of the more successful programs that we looked at in the research, to make sure that this is really a cross-governmental effort. I think that's also very important. And obviously for advocacy groups, for groups on the ground, you know, I think that it really needs to be a key influencing target, and, you know, there has to be advocacy by energy poor communities and civil society organisations, you know, sustained advocacy with policymakers on this issue.
Thank you so much. And thank you all for sticking with us a couple minutes over time. I know there are many questions that we have left unanswered kind of in the chats, and we'll do our best to kind of report back and share some thoughts with you. Thank you for submitting those. I think we should kind of wrap up, but as I mentioned, this is just a very small slice of all of the work and all of the insights that ODI, CAFOD, and our 6-country research partners have pulled together over many months, and delivering a lot of really key lessons learned on this topic. So I very much invite you to visit the links and learn more in the coming weeks. I will just say that we very much look forward to collaborating with all of you on this call, as well as your colleagues and others in the sector, to take this research further and ensure no one is left behind as we work towards Sustainable Development Goal 7. Please stay tuned. Please follow the conversation at SEforALL.org/ESN, and then also on social media with the hashtag #EnergySafetyNets. To close, I just want to extend a massive thank you to Andrew, Marefu, Sarah, and Sam for your work and your time with us today. And thank you to the audience for asking such compelling questions and furthering all of our work and progress to support the poor and vulnerable in accessing these truly life-changing energy services. Thank you all, and have a great rest of your day.